So potentially speaking, theoretically speaking, Ethiopia can fill the dam in 3 years. So the whole discussion about filling it in 4 to 7 years is all to minimize the damage that would come to downstream countries. So this is already a step that Ethiopia is taking in terms of taking in the concerns of downstream countries.
I think this shows how the power of cooperation.
I see the return to the tripartite discussions as somehow a lack of option.
Not only that Ethiopia has notified them, it has also shared a number of important documents, hundreds of documents, starting from the design of the GERD.
If Egypt did certain irrigation efficiency enhancement mechanisms and water conservation mechanisms in their country, they could save as much as 40 billion cubic meters of water per year.
Hello everyone, this is the Ethiopian News Agency show and I'm Desta Kasai, your host. And thank you our guests for joining us on the comprehensive dynamics of GERD. And the focus of this discussion will be on the dynamics of GERD, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is construction commenced in 2011 on the world's longest Nile River, with the view of enhancing mutual awareness and understanding among the Nile Basin countries. The show will focus on GERD, which Ethiopia is the major contributor with 85% of the Nile contribution. Our guests are Magdalawit Masai, an independent researcher on the other guest is Samuel Tefera, who has a PhD, is an assistant professor. And to begin with, as I have already mentioned, our issue is very selective, and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has been a very contentious issue with regards to Egypt particularly. And I think with the resumption of Egypt coming back again to the tripartite negotiation table, what do you think it really signifies, the coming back of Egypt to the tripartite negotiation table?
I think this shows how the power of cooperation, right? The importance and the power of cooperation in resolving disputes or conflicts between the Nile Basin initiatives, particularly between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. So first, it shows that. And second, and foremost, I think Egypt has not been actually shying away from negotiations. It has been in the negotiations. The most important challenge that we have seen during those trilateral and bilateral negotiations is that they were not very much genuinely trying to address and trying to find a resolve for the problems.
As you've mentioned, it has never been shying away from the negotiations. Rather, it has been deviating from it, and sometimes even some tend to quote it as changing the goals post. It brings one agenda now and then changes it the other time. And what do you think is the really cause for Egypt to tend on doing such kind of things?
I think their questions and demands were not based on genuine principles of equitable share of the Nile water resources, right? So they have been deviating from the mainstream agendas since a long time ago, and they have been promoting a grid, right, on the use of the Nile water. As you know, in the past, during the 1959 agreements that gave them the lion's share of the water use, they have been constantly pushing an agenda that maintains that status quo, right? And that status quo is not fair. They've been shying away from signing and ratifying the Nile Basin Cooperative Framework of Agreement, which actually has a principle of equitable share to each member of the Nile Basin countries. They have been very much politicizing the building. Since the building of the dam, they have been very much engaged in a propaganda that puts question on the rights and aspirations of other countries in the Nile Basin to develop their water. And Ethiopia, as a Nile Basin and a source country, has that right, and they have been against all these rights, right? These are our sovereign rights. I understand that they have some interests, local interests, national interests within their soil, and they are in an urge to promote those kind of interests that maximize their economic and political gains without regard to other basin member countries. So this has been there. They have been in the negotiations, as I've said earlier, constantly trying to prolong the negotiations, trying to make them fruitless in many different aspects. They've been using a shuttling diplomacy, running beyond the continent to seek solutions for a problem which actually can be addressed within Africa or within the three parties. So this was what they have been doing, and this is what, again, they will try to do in the future.
Well, I see the return to the tripartite discussions as somehow a lack of option, because if you see the precedents that happened before they agreed to come back to discussion, you see the letter to the UN Security Council not having the kind of impact they expected, and then you see the backlash from the EU, the UN, and also the AU, sort of pushing these countries to deal with their issues on their own, so sort of pushing for the tripartite discussion. So I feel like they are fighting this fight on all fronts. So there's the diplomatic route, the international route, the national route, the proxy wars, all of those things. And I feel like them coming back to the tripartite discussion is a show of their other strategies not having the impact that they expected. So as far as I know, negotiation is the only option on the Ethiopian table. So it's really nice that they're back to the negotiations, and negotiations are the only way forward. But I think it's also important to be cognizant of the precedents that pushed these three countries to come back together. As for your question to what is the root of all these problems, it always goes back to their historical benefits and what they call as their historical rights. So for millennia, they have been used to using the lion's share of the water. They have had this uncontested monopoly throughout history. Their colonizers, their protectorates, and basically the whole of the world has been aiding in ensuring that this historical right of Egypt was protected until now. So it all goes back to making sure that the hegemony and the uncontested benefit they had over the Nile persists now, and there is clear danger for that, not just from the not just because of the GERD, but also because of the precedent that the GERD and Ethiopia sets for other countries in terms of utilizing their waters to their own benefits. So the way I see it, it always goes back to that. Because the issue when it comes to the filling operation, water use in the Nile Basin, it's not political. As far as the scientific and the technical matters go, it is a doable thing. The water is enough for us if we ensure that sustainable water use mechanisms are in place, and if we have this equitable and reasonable water use in the basin, which is at the moment very lacking. If we ensure these two things are in place, we can sustainably use the water for all Nile Basin riparian countries. The problem is now that we're dealing with a country which is basically used to having the whole of the pie or the whole of the cake. So any kind of sharing feels like injustice for them. Any kind of loss in the water is going to be significant loss to them. So the way I see it, there is no convoluted issue here. It all goes back to Egypt not wanting to lose its historical hegemony, its historical unjustified benefits and share of the Nile waters.
And I will come back to you, and Samuel, you may comment at least in the political scenario of it. And do you think this is attainable, going back to retaining its historical benefits, which, as Magdalena has mentioned, all the whole pie? Can this really be attainable currently?
I don't think this is attainable in this era. The hydropolitics regime has changed now. We are not in the 1940s, 50s, where countries have a different political and state arrangements. and the global dynamics, the international politics have actually significantly changed over time. And now the way forward is a compromise, right? A cooperation. And you need to give something to gain something. And they are trying to prolong that old, outdated political position when it comes to the rights of use of the Nile water rivers. And that's not attainable at all. I understand that getting filling or impoundment of the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is not a very serious challenge for Egypt, technically. It's more of a political issue, because if you take the maximum, the shortest period that takes to fill the dam, which is 2 or 3 years, taking into account an annual precipitation of 817 millimeters in Ethiopian highlands, the causes, I mean the results of that impoundment is not very significant and serious. It will probably affect somehow like arable lands, productivity in the arable lands in the delta and in the upstream. It may affect population distribution, because Egypt since last year has announced a plan to establish over 20 new cities out of the blue, right? They're going to they're going to build many mega smart green mega cities throughout the country from scratch on the sands. And that's a huge investment. That requires a huge amount of water. That requires a huge amount of financial investment. And that also involves a huge loss of the valuable water, right? If you can take the current scenarios, for example, the current facts, Egypt uses over 80 to 85% of the Nile water, but the contribution of agriculture to Egypt's GDP is not more than 15%. It's between 11 and 15%. Hydroelectric power generation, it's not more than 10%, right? It's about 10, 12%. And bring that scenario to Ethiopia. And we have a very agricultural society, highly dependent on agriculture. The GDP, the economic growth, all sorts of developments are very much water-oriented compared to Egypt. And they understand that. And in terms of infrastructure developed, they are in a better position. They have well-developed electrification schemes. They have many alternative electric generation options and resources. But you wonder, why is it then that they're very much aggressively into the greed of using the water without the context of like the principle of equitable share? And here we note that the important contribution the Gulf countries have in Egypt's economy, particularly in maintaining the oligarchy of the Egypt military regime. If you take an example, for example, only probably 2 Gulf state companies monopolize the water. Out of Egypt's historic 55.5 billion cubic meter of water reserve, a company or 2 have a huge share, about like 5.5 billion, which is 1/10 of that historic reserve, right? So you can imagine then what's happening in Egypt. In Egypt, those companies manipulate the agricultural sector, particularly the large-scale investment agricultural sector. They produce crops, and they export crops to their own countries, to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And those countries have principles, and the companies have obligations, actually, to export at least half of the produce that they have produced within the soils of Egypt using the Nile River, right, to their countries. And in their countries, they cannot they have banned actually the growing of some water-intensive crops like alfalfa, which is used in the livestock feed processing. You have maize, which requires a lot of water. You have rice, which requires another huge water resource. Those companies are exporting foods and exporting these products by producing them in Egypt's soil. And any compromise made in the amount of water that Egypt gets from Nile would directly affect the interests, the economic and political interests of these countries. And you wonder, is the Egyptian government looking at the things from maximizing its own political and economic interests, or from maximizing and supporting the political and economic interests of other Gulf countries. So we need to understand the balance between these 2 points. So it's not justifiable. I understand the impoundment of GERD within a very short period of time would definitely affect, insignificantly of course, the water shares of Egypt and the Egyptian government, but it is not as such a very serious and significant impact that it would impart on the uses of the water by Egypt and Sudan. The benefits are, I think, much 100-folds than the side effects.
And on the last thing he mentioned, I think the technical matters. Do you think that there is a valid reason within the claims of Egypt with regard especially the recent one, the filling of GERD, the first phase of the filling? Do you think there is any valid reason that it will cause any significant harm on the Egypt side?
We have to be careful when we talk about significant harm. This concept of significant harm, and in relation to that, the concept of, or the principle of equitable use. It's not about a project, it's about water allocation in a basin. So you can only talk about significant harm under the guise of equitable use. So assuming there is a fair and equitable share of a water in a basin, then when a country goes beyond its share, beyond its equitable quota, and causes harm on a country, on another riparian country, we call that significant harm. As things stand now in the Nile Basin, we don't have a fair and equitable water sharing agreement. What we have now was the colonial agreement of 1929 and the modified colonial agreement of the 1959, which divides the water that belongs to 11 countries between 2 countries. So when we talk about significant harm, it's against this backdrop. Any kind of reduction in water loss in light of the 1959 agreement is going to come about as significant harm because, as I said earlier, they are used to using the whole of the water. So without this foundation of equitable and reasonable use in the basin, we can't even start to talk about significant harm because significant harm is only applicable as long as we have this fair and equitable share in the basin, which we don't have. So all these negotiations and discussions on the dam filling and the dam operation, they are not happening out of responsibility of Ethiopia to engage these countries, but out of goodwill and cooperation. Because there's no legal framework that binds Ethiopia to be a part of these discussions. Again, because we don't have an equitable share in the basin, so we're entitled to do whatever, which is basically what Egypt and Sudan did for years now when they built their numerous infrastructures. So without having that backdrop of equitable and reasonable use, it's quite misleading, and I think it could also be quite distracting to talk about significant harm, because any kind of harm is going to come about as significant harm. But leaving this academic discussion for the time being, if you look at the implications of the filling of the GERD on Egypt, so we're talking about a country which has 100% food security, 100% water security, 100% energy security, with a country which has a huge dam with a multi-year reservoir system. So it is a country, potentially speaking, it is a country which can buffer any impact that the GERD might have on it. And truth be told, the whole discussion about this filling and operation time is to minimize the amount of damage that would come to these downstream countries. So potentially speaking, theoretically speaking, Ethiopia can fill the dam in 3 years. So the whole discussion about filling it in 4 to 7 years is all to minimize the damage that would come to downstream countries. So this is already a step that Ethiopia is taking in terms of taking in the concerns of downstream countries, but it has to be reciprocated from the other side as well. Currently, water use and water use efficiency in Egypt is quite low because their irrigation practices are quite ancient and wasteful. Evaporation loss from their dams is quite high, and basically water use in Egypt does not really coincide with the water scarcity narrative that they perpetrate. So from the Ethiopian side, measures are being taken to ensure that the impact to downstream countries is as minimal as possible. But I think that has to be reciprocated from the other side as well. They have to engage in increasing their efficiency or implementing water-saving practices in their country. There was a study that was done by an Egyptian scholar, and I mean, this is their own person speaking. And the conclusion of that study was that if Egypt did certain irrigation efficiency enhancement mechanisms and water conservation mechanisms in their country, they could save as much as 40 billion cubic meters of water per year. 40, like, to put it in context, the flow of the Nile, the flow of the Blue Nile, annual flow of the Blue Nile is 49 billion cubic meters. They could save as much as the annual flow of the Blue Nile if they implemented certain measures to ensure that their water uses were more judicious and were more effective. So technically speaking, the impact of the GERD in Egypt, there will be impact. We're not saying that the GERD is not going to have impact, and the longer the filling time of the GERD, the lower the impacts will be to downstream countries, it's obvious. But we also have to balance it out with the economic benefits and also the social value and the social implications the faster filling of the GERD would have for Ethiopia as well. So we have to balance that out. But I think it's quite important also that the burden is not just on Ethiopia alone, because the way things are going, it feels like that. It feels like Ethiopia has to do this, Ethiopia has to do that. In case of drought, Ethiopia has to release this amount, that amount, without actually having to place any kind of responsibility on these other downstream countries. So again, to answer your question simply, will the GERD have significant impact on the use, on Egyptian use? No, it is manageable because, again, as I said earlier, Egypt is a country which already has food, water, energy security, and alternative resources, and a huge dam with multi-year water reservoir. So technically speaking, they have the capacity to buffer any kind of damage that might come to them. And we're just talking about the filling period. The flow of the water is going to resume once the dam is fully operational. So it's not like these agricultural lands or this, like what they say, this agricultural lands being lost and all that. It's not like they're gone forever. They can potentially be back after the dam is operational. The issue is never technical. It's never about the science or the actual effect on the land, but more political.
Yeah, as you mentioned very clearly, I think Samuel even touched it very well. They have a minimal way of efficient use of water too. They have multiple options in even enhancing the water use there. But at the same time, again, they tend to say that Ethiopia is not getting in a very proactive negotiation, especially with regard to the new phase, the rainy season filling of the first phase. Ethiopia has not notified us, and we have not reached an agreement. And on the other hand, even experts say that Ethiopia does not have any compelling reasons or binding legal frameworks that binds Ethiopia to notify them, so long as they have rejected and opposed to be part of the CFA. And what's your point of view towards this?
Ethiopia doesn't have any obligation to do that, but as a country who has a foreign policy that is very much fundamentally focused on principles, right? It has notified. Not only that, Ethiopia has notified them, it has also shared a number of important documents, hundreds of documents, starting from the design of the GERD. And this shows Ethiopia's interest and willingness to cooperation. And this has been our policy, despite changes in regimes. Since the Menelik time, during the Haile Selassie, the Derg regime, Mengistu's time, the EPRDF and now PP, despite their differences, ideological differences, all of them have subscribed to this principle of equitable share and friendship. And that's what we're doing it. And it's in a show of that that Ethiopia has actually shared those documents to Egypt and Sudan to comment, to give their feedbacks, and went out of its way actually in some points during the establishment of the International Panel of Experts who have been conducting some assessments on the hydrological and environmental impact of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It has even entertained questions from Egypt to pursue a single assessment, right, against the assessments that the three countries were conducting. We've done everything. No country in the world actually have a history of sharing the details of its unilateral project to other countries who definitely have some stakes and who definitely will be standing against it. We did that. Not only sharing to discuss on the potential challenges and opportunities of the dam, but also the Ethiopian government during Meles time have actually proposed Egypt and Sudan to buy a share, to have a stake in the construction of the dam so that this dam would change. It has changed actually, but it would have more changed the political landscape in the region. And it would have promoted more economic integration because everybody has a stake in it. There will be more investment coming out of those cooperative engagements, which would increase the power generation capacity, which would reduce these questions of technical feasibility, which actually is it yesterday or 2 days ago, the Egyptian Ministry of Water and Irrigation and Water Resources was mentioning that GERD actually is in a good position compared to the dams that they have in Egypt and Sudan. You can assume worst case scenarios like earthquakes. If it happens, it will happen. But even if you take that into account, by all standards, GERD stands much better than the other dams in the project. So we don't have the obligation. Those accusations are not valid, but we've gone far to refresh and to renew the old-time, outdated colonial era mentality that have failed the basin, and then replace it with more cooperative framework, which Egypt was not a party to, and Sudan was not a party to. You can imagine, during a decades of discussions that led to the birth of the Nile Basin Cooperative Framework of Agreement by the Nile Basin Initiative, Nile Basin Initiatives, the Egypt and Sudan were tolerated a lot. The other countries were so patient to bring them to the framework. They have rejected actually signing the document because they said like some phrases have to be included, the significant harm and maintenance of the current historical water uses and so on and so forth. It was not agreed, and they even demanded a veto. That was not also agreed because they are just individual countries. But to their interest, all those discussions were annexed, and they were even asked to sign on a paper. They didn't agree on that. So this shows that they have some other agendas and interests beyond developing the Nile River Basin within the basin system. So I think even now, as we continue with the renewed negotiations, Ethiopia should be very cautious and should very much be careful in terms of running or continuing a discourse that has been there, which is we should not entertain an agenda and we should discontinue this, the historic water rights and water appropriation points and invite the other remaining Nile Basin countries into the round table of discussions. Because Nile is not about Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. It's about the other remaining countries in the basin. We have 11 countries, right? Some of which have ratified it, some of which are in the process of accession. And there are also some who are not active in terms of developing the basin out of economic problems. So we need to take into account, we should not be discussing on who gets which amount of water. That's very colonial. we should not be doing the same mistake that Egypt has been doing, and we've been against it. If we need a sustainable peace, a sustainable economic development in the region, each and every country has to make sure that its interest and aspirations for development is enshrined within this framework, and that those discussions need to bring all those together into the table again.